Welcome back to Hoffman Tactical. So in today's video, we're going to be out here shooting these two Orcas. We actually have a very special guest on here who we are actually filming with today. The man himself, print, shoot, repeat. And we're going to be out here shooting these Orcas. We've actually going to put about 600 rounds through them. And we had quite a few. I think this guy right here, we actually, PSR actually melted my Orca. Well, that was partly me, but yeah. So this guy here, we really heated until we got malfunction. So that was interesting with PLA. This guy here has run great the entire time, but we got some super awesome ejection footage, some super slow-mo at how many frames per second is that?
240, and then we got 960.
Yeah, so it is actually quite interesting. There's quite a few little observations to make. So in this video, we're gonna go over kind of what we learned. This will be sort of a more behind the scenes, like technical video, and it should be super awesome. There are three different things I want to talk about in today's video. The first of those has to do with the clips that hold the Orca together. They hold the handguard onto the upper and the stock onto the lower. If you have been following me along on my other platforms, you will know that I actually had some failures a while back with those clips, which were originally made from a polycarbonate blend, and they ended up cracking after being installed in the Orca for a while, and that caused my handguard to come loose on one of my Orcas. Since then, I have moved to using a carbon fiber nylon, which has worked great without any problems. But the Orcas I have still had a couple polycarbonate clips on either the handguard side or the stock side. So the first thing I did today before starting to shoot was I swapped out the remaining polycarbonate clips for nylon ones. These clips hadn't broken yet, but I was still having, didn't want to have a problem with them later, and I replaced them with nylon. What was interesting was after taking the clips off, I inspected them and they were indeed beginning to crack. So I've got some shots of them so you can see them in more detail. And one of the clips on the stock that held the stock on had one of the top stock clips had actually fully cracked. The stock was still being held in place, but it had fully cracked, and it was only the other three clips that were keeping the stock where it should be. The front clips and the other stock clips had also signs of cracking. Cracks had started to form, but they hadn't fully broken yet. So this just goes to show that the polycarbonate is definitely a problem. It wasn't just a fluke accident I had. I've also had other failures with polycarbonates on other parts, and it unfortunately is a pretty persistent problem with either fatigue or cracking under constant stress for a long period of time. I'm not quite sure what the relationship there is, but cracking with polycarbonate at loads where it shouldn't fail at all is a very big problem, and as time goes on, I use less and less polycarbonate. The next thing I want to talk about has to do with the PLA Plus Orca. Now, unfortunately, I don't know how many rounds we shot through that Orca today because we were alternating between the two Orcas, and we shot about 600 rounds in total. Basically shot, filmed, moved around, and all of that. So I'm not sure how many rounds and what order we put them through. I do know that with the PLA Plus Orca, I had my super safety installed, and we were shooting lots of rounds pretty quickly, doing a bunch of filming, and it was a number of magazines. We let it sit for a while, cool off a little bit, did some more shooting, and at some point there it got soft around the hose clamp, around the barrel extension. The entire area there on both the upper and handguard softened up. The symptom that we had was that we just started getting failures to fire. So I'd pull the trigger, nothing would happen. There'd be a round in the chamber and nothing would happen. We'd have to chamber a new round, and that one would fire. We'd fire like maybe 2-3 rounds, nothing would happen, and then after a while it would only fire like, basically it was like single shot, or it didn't fire at all. I initially thought it was due to a problem in the fire control group, but upon closer inspection, what happened was, due to the softening I mentioned, the barrel and barrel mounts were able to move forward in the upper receiver into the handguard, and the entire handguard shifted forward as well due to the plastic softening and kind of stretching out underneath the clips, and that made it so that the system could not go fully into battery. The bolt carrier group was running into the inside face of the upper receiver, or the bolt carrier was running into that face and preventing the system from locking out properly. And that resulted in a failure to fire. That's the first time I've actually had this happen on any Orca. I've never gotten one hot enough to actually have that malfunction. So that is very interesting, and that is kind of the failure mode when you overheat an Orca. So I think that's pretty interesting to keep in mind. It wasn't really anything spontaneous. I just started getting failures to fire. I think the reason it happened was, number one, we were firing a lot of ammo, so it was probably like 150, 180 rounds. It was more than that, but it wasn't all at once, so it was kind of accumulated over like an hour or so. That caused it to heat up. Also, this Orca had been abused in the past. It had 1,000 rounds on it when we started shooting. I had already put 4+ mags through it in multiple different sittings all at once, and that had gotten really hot and softened. So the barrel was already starting to move forward, I think, a little bit. The damage was already partially done, and then we kind of just fired enough rounds where we were able to soften it, where it actually finally shifted, the barrel shifts enough where we started getting malfunction. So that was super interesting. One of the really fun things we did was we took the Orca out to 300 yards and shot at reactive targets on steel, silhouette targets. So the little reactive Firebird targets, I believe is what they're called, and I put them onto the steel silhouette targets, and we shot at them at 300 yards and actually got a lot of really good hits. The Orca is probably doing like 6 MOA, and we're probably getting like an 18-inch circle. That's according to my testing, but we seem to be getting better hits than that because we were hitting things that were closer to 6 inches in diameter a lot more consistently. So that was interesting and very promising. I was really pleased with that. It was fun to be able to actually hit stuff, silhouette-sized objects at 300 yards. So that was super cool. As to reliability, obviously we had the overheating issue with the PLA Plus Orca that resulted in lots of failures to fire, but other than that, we actually had really good reliability. The only issues we had were due to ammunition, which we were shooting some reloads, which unfortunately had a lot of issues with the primers not being fully seated, and that resulted in lots of problems and malfunctions. However, that was simply an ammo problem and not really due to the Orcas. And the last thing I want to talk about is one of the most interesting ones, and that is the deflection of the brass deflector when actually the brass was ejecting. PSR has a high-speed camera. We were taking at like 900 something frames per second. We got some really nice shots of the brass deflecting. And if you were following along in my development stages, one of the big issues I had while development that was kind of the most persistent issue was the just ejection. I was having a lot of issues with the brass kind of bouncing back into the ejection port and causing jams and such to occur. I finally fixed it by changing the way the brass deflected. On a conventional aluminum upper receiver, the brass hits the brass deflector and then slides off the brass deflector out into space, and that's how the ejection works. It kind of slaps against the brass deflector and then slides off. On the Orca, I changed it up so the brass comes back, hits the brass deflector, and then bounces perpendicular off the brass deflector straight out. So the round just kind of goes out, boom, and then comes right out the side like that. Rather than on a mil-spec aluminum upper, it hits it and then slides off like that. And I did that because the plastic wanted to bounce no matter what I did. Aluminum likes to slide. The plastic would bounce almost no matter what. So that's what I did, and that worked. We have not had any ejection issues. However, under the high-speed footage, we can see there are some inconsistencies, which are pretty cool. On the PLA Plus upper receiver, the gray guy, we had very consistent ejection, like I would expect with my design, operating as it was intended, with the brass bouncing off of the deflector. However, with the carbon fiber nylon upper receiver, we would get a mix. Some of the shells would bounce and others would slide, and it would end up with kind of a two-directional, very distinct two-directional ejection. Some of the brass would go kind of forward at 2 o'clock, and the other brass would go backwards like 4 o'clock, because the forward brass was deflecting, was hitting the brass deflector and then bouncing forward, and then the 4 o'clock brass was hitting it and then sliding off the deflector back at 4 o'clock. So that was quite interesting. I originally thought this inconsistency was caused by the difference in material between the PLA Plus and the carbon fiber nylon. However, inspecting the high-speed footage very, very closely shows that the difference actually has to do with the way the brass comes off of the bolt face. I can see on the first shot here, when the brass rotates off the bolt face, it only does so about 90 degrees before the bolt bottoms out on the base of the buffer tube, and the brass is then kind of rotated and slingshotted backwards, where it's the tip of the brass, the area right around the shoulder, smacks into the brass deflector and it bounces straight off forward. However, in this shot where we have the more of the sliding effect, we can see that the brass rotates further off the bolt face, so that by the time the bolt bottoms out, has already rotated backwards to some degree, and by the time it contacts with the brass deflector, it's further out and further back, so that the mid part of the brass case hits the brass deflector rather than the shoulder. And this is a different dynamic, and it results in the sliding action rather than the bouncing action. Earlier I mentioned that the PLA Plus version did not have this inconsistency, but upon inspecting the footage in more detail, I found that on some occasions the brass did deflect in a similar way as the carbon fiber nylon version. So I think that it's not really directly related to a particular bolt carrier or a particular material. It's just kind of an inconsistency that happens with AR-15 bolt carrier groups, and we don't normally notice it because the normal brass deflector geometry with aluminum doesn't have any of these ejection anomalies. Doing more research into why the brass flips off the bolt face in the way it does would be most interesting. This is really not a problem at all. We're not having any reliability issues, but it is something interesting to observe and to see those little subtleties in ejection that can cause a problem if your deflector geometry is not correct. That was a ton of fun. The Orca, this one here, the carbon fiber guy, performed really, really well. Obviously, this guy got super, super hot, but I'm hoping that this video was informative and helped you guys understand a little bit more about the Orca, the subtleties with the ejection, which I think is really fascinating, as well as the thermal limits you run into with PLA. So this was a ton of fun, PSR. I really, really appreciate you having me over. It's been an incredible opportunity. And I think everyone knows where to find your stuff.
Print, shoot, repeat. Don't Google that.
Yeah. Print, shoot, repeat. You will find his stuff, and I'll let you have it if you want to do an outro.
So yes, thank you guys for watching. This has been in another episode of Hoffman Tactical. Yes, the collab.
Yes,
we've been waiting for. And till next time, we'll see you then.